Welcome to Back to Science. Reading, writing, and calculating. We all know how to use these skills, but are these skills acquired naturally? Or does someone need to teach us how? These are the skills we learn, adapt, and experience during our lifetime, so-called cultural learning. In this video, we will discuss quite an interesting hypothesis, the neurorecycling. This hypothesis aimed to explain how fundamental elements of the human culture, such as reading, arithmetic, are mapped at the cortical level. Also, how the relation between cultural and cortical representations should be theorized. We can say that cognitive functions are direct product of the activity of specific biological organ. As in the case of functions produced by other biological organs, such as the digestion function produced by the stomach and related organs. In the case of the mind and the brain, there is a complex relationship between organ and function. The mind and brain influence each other, imposing reciprocal consistence in a form of circular causality. On the one side, the organ brain allows the expression of cognitive functions, but on the other, it imposes precise constraints on them. For example, our stomach doesn't have digestive enzyme for the transformation of cellulose. Therefore, the substances we can fully absorb are limited. Also, the speed of neurotransmission is subject to biochemical or biophysical constraints, the electrical transmission along the axons. Consequently, the speed with which we can react to external stimulus is limited. In turn, cognition deeply modifies the way our brain works. For example, a diet too rich in fatty substances implies a great effort for the digestive system so it can produce structural alternations of the organs involved. Learning how to read induces important changes in the brain. Cultural objects such as tools or writing systems are recent, optional, and acquired by learning. Specifically, they are not present at birth and do not develop spontaneously, but rather need explicit teaching to be acquired. Here are two properties: not present at birth and need explicit teaching. The examples of knowledge or skills that are present at birth do not spontaneously develop even in the absence of the formal teaching are walking, basic tool use, dancing, talking, gesturing, and singing. Then the examples that are absent at birth but need explicit teaching to be acquired, the cultural acquisition, are reading, writing, math, science, religion, philosophy, and so on. Is this feature only special for humans or can be found in primates? Some researchers review 7 most long-term studies with chimps. There were important differences in the cultural repertoires developed in the 6 communities of chimps studied in the 6 areas of the African continent. They found that 39 different behavior patterns, including tool use, grooming, and countership behaviors, are customary or habitual in some communities, but are absent in others where ecological explanations have been discounted. However, compared to humans, primates show much reduced cultural creativity. Why? The specificity of the rich and complex cultural invention depending on our ability to use symbols. The skills we have thanks to our ability to use symbols are reading and arithmetic. Reading is the ability to translate arbitrary visual symbols into elements of a spoken language and therefore access meaning. Thanks to our ability of reading, we could massively extend our memory capacity, and it allowed sharing of information among people who are distant from the space and time. Arithmetic is the ability to use arbitrary symbols to mentally represent quantities, objects, and relations, and to mentally transform them. Thanks to our ability in arithmetic, the development of science, medicine, technology, and architecture were made possible. Also, it allows the disappearing of the laws of nature. Reading and arithmetic are extraordinary cultural inventions, but they are very recent in the history of human, and even today, these skills are not universal. Natural evolution operates on very long time scales. Given a recently of the invention of literacy and numeracy in the history of Homo sapiens, it is very improbable that natural evolution or natural selection had sufficient time to pre-select a neuronal architecture specifically dedicated to supporting these recent culturally transmitted cognitive skills. In a nutshell, we are not born with reading module nor with an arithmetic module in our brains. However, cognitive neuroscience tells us that the neurocognitive mechanisms specifically involved in reading and arithmetic are surprisingly consistent across individuals and cultures. This means that all human beings learn to read or calculate using the same basic cognitive skills and the very same neural circuits. The hypothesis that explains this apparent paradox is called the cultural recycling of cortical map or neural recycling hypothesis. The key point of this hypothesis is that cultural traditions are how much they find an adequate neural niche in our brains. Acceptation, co-optation, pre-adaptation are all synonym terms used in the theory of evolution to indicate a change of the function of physical or behavioral trait during evolution. Some traits have been selected during evolution because they supported evolutionarily relevant adaptive function. However, they later appear to be able to support new functions that are different from the ones that had the initial evolutionary advantage. The first classic example is the feather, which was selected for thermoregulation and turns out to be an excellent tool to facilitate flying in birds. The second is social behavior. The subdominant wolf licked the face of dominant ones as a sign of social hierarchy, like the dogs with humans. This derives from the presumably innate reflex of licking the adult's mouth to get regurgitated food. It is possible to think of cultural learning as a very special form of acceptation. In this view, at least in some domains, cultural learning may involve reusing neurocognitive systems that exist before cultural development has been selected by natural selection to support evolutionary function. During their cultural history, humans harness those pre-existing neurocognitive systems and adapt them to devote them to novel scopes. The hypothesis of neural recycling of cultural maps suggests that the human brain at birth is not a tabula rasa, but it is constituted by specialized modular systems that are plastic and that adapt to cultural environment they are immersed in. These systems are minimally reconverted to support new cultural specific functions. Our neural architecture is highly limited and constrained by its predetermined pattern of connectivity. It is determined by genetic rules, which however also include a certain degree of plasticity, which is itself genetically determined. New cultural acquisitions are possible only if we use some degree of plasticity. Every cultural object had passed through generations because they found an adequate neural niche in our brain. The human brain at birth is already highly structured. This is so-called startup system. It constrains a series of neurocognitive modules, which are neural systems that support specific cognitive skills and that are characterized by high degree of plasticity, supporting the fast and efficient learning. Here are examples of systems with evidence. The language system is already there when we are born. Dehaene and colleagues set up a study that investigated a cortical response to the language of 2-month-old baby. Their cortical responses were very similar in patterns and localization to adults. Other study by Johnson, Simon, and Ferroni showed the social skills module. 3-days-old baby preferred faces rather than scrambled image, and they preferred direct eye contact rather than non-eye contact. The hearings study showed that the cortical responses to the face of 3-month-old babies were on the right occipitotemporal cortex, which is the area of fusiform face area. Buati showed this stimuli to 2-days-old newborns. The images consisted of simple geometrical shape, either similar to face configuration, as you see in this figure. The results were that the brain response is synchronized to the stimulus presentation, but more so in the face-like compared to the control condition. The localization of this response was in the occipitotemporal cortex of the right hemisphere, similar to the face circuit observed in adults. To summarize these studies, neurocognitive systems support basic evolutionary ancient skills useful for survival. That is fundamental for the cultural-based acquisition of more complex cognitive skills. They are precursor systems that at the same time support but also constrain later cultural learning. This reuse does not involve any genetic reshuffling but occurs during the lifespan as a result of brain plasticity. The term neurorecycling was therefore introduced to refer to the putative mechanism by which a novel cultural object encroaches onto the pre-existing brain system. The neurorecycling hypothesis consists of following postulations, and these postulations lead to some predictions concerning cultural acquisition and several bases. As a result of natural evolution, the brain organization is subject to strong anatomical constraints. This early organization of the brain in neural maps, which coding preference are present early in development, influences later cultural learning. Therefore, the brain regions involved in a given cultural function or cultural map should be consistent across individuals and cultures, and they should be systematically related to precursor map coding for a similar evolutionary relevant function. Cultural acquisition, such as reading and math, need to find their neural niche, which is a series of cerebral circuits whose basic functions are sufficiently close to the novel culturally acquired function and sufficiently plastic to undergo a parietal reconversion to support the novel use. This leads to prediction that the speed and ease of which novel culture skills are acquired should be determined by the complexity of the recycling required. The complexity should reflect two components: the distance from the evolutionary precursor to the new function, intrinsic computational complexity of cultural system. Third, their prior organization is never entirely erased because neural plasticity is limited when cortical territories initially dedicated to evolutionary ancient functions are recruited to support novel cultural functions. Thus, prior neural constraints powerfully influence cultural acquisition and adult organization. then it should be possible to observe some specific changes in the perceptual or cognitive skills originally supported by the recycled cortical territory. Also, there should be important cross-cultural invariance in the implementation of the culturally transmitted functions, and they should be ultimately tracked to neural constraints. Okay, this was the introduction of the hypothesis neural recycling. The next two videos will go deeper into the hypothesis with the following arithmetic and reading. See you then.